Welcome back. I'm Terri Combs-Orme from the University of Tennessee College of Social Work, and in this class we're going to talk about brain development and functioning. We'll discuss those things in more detail later when we talk about the different life stages. This course is provided at no cost to you by the College of Social Work at the University of Tennessee and the Urban Child Institute in Memphis, Tennessee. There are no restrictions on your use of this material, and you can email me at the address you see on the screen here if you have questions about any of it. So why should social workers study neuroscience anyway? Although it's begun to enter our literature somewhat, I don't think everybody's convinced that neuroscience is important to what we do. The first reason it's important is that the brain is the foundation of who we are. Our personalities, our behavior, even our physical health lies in the health of our brains. So understanding that can help us understand clients a lot better and maybe figure out why they're coming from where they're coming from. Second, the brain really drives all physiological processes. So understanding that will also help us as we talk with colleagues in other fields, including physicians and psychologists. Psychology has definitely already tracked into neuroscience, and social work now needs to become part of the community that talks about brain function. First, let's talk about a little basic terminology. Neurons are brain cells. You see in the picture the orange figure here. Neurons are mostly all present when we're born, although not all together. We'll talk about that later. But neurons can't do anything on their own. They must be connected to other neurons to perform any work. So we need to think about the connectors between the neurons and among the neurons. Axons, you can see on the picture here, are projections from neurons that transmit signals to the other neurons nearby or far away, depends on what's happening. Dendrites are the projections from neurons that receive those signals. So together they make it possible for neurons to work together. Both of these connections begin forming prenatally and continue throughout life, although at a much less rapid rate as you get older. So we mentioned that neurons work together. They do this through connections called synapses. Synapses are formed, these chemical messengers flow across the gap between neurons every time you have an experience. They are strengthened by the same experience being repeated, and they're weakened by the experience not being done anymore. So one of the things we understand now is that learning is synapse formation. Even psychotherapy is synapse formation, and we'll talk about that in some more detail later. So the important thing to remember about this is repeated experience strengthens your synapses. Think about when you learn to ride a bicycle. So over and over, if you were like me, you practiced controlling your balance and getting your eyes and your arm and leg movements to work together, and you began to fall less as time went on. Driving is actually the same way. Much of it is motor memory. We do have to pay attention in both cases, but the movements that we perform when driving, such as putting on a signal or stepping on the gas, those things are embedded in our motor memory through synapses. My favorite example of this is my yellow lab, Abby. Abby is crazy about cheese. And neurons that fire together could be represented by the sound of the refrigerator opening, and no matter how quiet I am, the cheese drawer opening, and then the crackle of the paper on the cheese as I take it out. I have tried to do that so quietly, and sometimes when she is upstairs. But those synapses are very strong, and generally speaking, she's there before I even get the cheese out. So this type of learning occurs even in the earliest days of life, before your episodic memory has developed, before you can remember things that happened when you were a baby. You have formed some implicit memories. This is why the quality and nurturing of early parenting is so important for future development, because synapses form that either tell you that you are a valuable person, your needs will be met, you're safe in this world, or otherwise. You don't remember being left in your crib for hours at a time without a bottle when you're hungry and you're wet. But your brain, you don't remember those episodes, but your brain remembers, and it affects your relationships and everything else in your life. Now, another thing to understand about the brain, and this will become more important later when we talk about the life stages. Notice in this picture the outer layer on the axons and dendrites. This outer layer insulates these connections, much like a lamp, so that you are able to get your signals flowing rapidly and efficiently. The development of myelin is affected by all kinds of things in the environment. For instance, it's been found that babies who live in very noisy, chaotic environments have trouble learning language, partly because their brains don't myelate properly. This just illustrates the importance of insulation. This is going on most rapidly in between 7 and 18 months of development, but some of it also occurs in adolescence. You read a lot about the brain and which parts of the brain fire or become active when you do various activities. And we know that from functional magnetic resonance imagery, which is a relatively new technology, probably within the last couple of decades, and it's still being perfected. It's non-invasive except for the noise, and what it does is measure brain activity in real time. If you've ever had an MRI, when you broke a bone or something like that, that is taking a single point in time kind of image. Functional MRI is able to capture in real time. For example, while you're looking at pictures that are shown to you in the chamber, it can be observed which parts of your brain are active. We can't use fMRI very well with children and infants because you have to remain so still. But new technologies are being developed now that we hope will be able to help us see more real-time brain activity in infants. I do want to emphasize that we speak about these findings as if they were truth with a capital T. fMRI is not a perfect methodology. There are a number of ways it can be altered. I just recently read that even breathing patterns can change different activity levels in parts of the brain. So as it gets better, it will be a better measure for us, but it is important to keep in mind that it's not like really looking at a brain internally. So two basic principles are most important to us as social workers. First of all, the brain develops from the bottom up. Back here, the brain stem is first, and then it develops all the way around to the front, to the top of the brain. And this is not just the parts of the brain, but it's also from simple to complex. The second thing that it's important to remember is that although most brain development occurs in the first 3 years of life, and we talk a lot about those golden 3 years, the brain is a plastic organ and remains plastic to one degree or another throughout your life. So you can even grow new neurons in old age. And it's important to us to remember this because if the brain were not plastic, it would be pointless to do psychotherapy. Individuals' brains have to change for their behavior and feelings to change. So, again, from the bottom up, emphasizes that just a few days after conception, the fetus brain begins to develop from the bottom up. These are simple autonomic functions, but the important thing is that each new structure relies on the lower, simpler structures being well developed in order to develop in the best way. And this makes a lot of sense if you think about it. If the simple functions of the brain stem, which simply support breathing and heartbeat, do not develop well, it's going to be very hard for the next layer up to develop well, where your brain develops the ability to move your muscles, and even, you can even not be alive if the brain stem is damaged badly enough. You can see in these two illustrations the from the bottom up philosophy. Up at 3 weeks, you basically got mostly just a brain stem, and it begins to expand. And by the time an infant is born, all the parts are there, but they're not connected very well. And infancy is about synapses forming. So neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to change with experience. And I want to emphasize that's not just functionally, but structurally. This is greatest early in life because the brain is developing so rapidly. And when an organ is developing rapidly, there's more opportunity for changes to be made. Neuroplasticity is the foundation of everything. And as you get older, you form synapses that reflect your experience in life. Recovery from brain injuries often occurs due to the plasticity of the brain. For instance, someone who injures one part of the brain, say for vision, may find that the brain recruits another part of the brain, another sensory part, to pick up that function. So this is one of the ways that rehabilitation works, is to help an individual's brain develop new ways of accomplishing the same function. Remember too, effective psychotherapy is learning and it's synaptogenesis. Cognitive behavior therapy may help you have more positive thoughts by getting rid of those negative thoughts. When you abandon those negative thoughts and continually practice the positive thoughts, you are literally growing new synapses, new networks in your brain. Now, we've all heard the sort of use it or lose it statement. And that refers back to something we talked about a minute ago about how synapses get stronger as you use them, but they will get weaker if you don't continue to use them. One of the ways this happens is through something called pruning. So Pruning is really an elegant way for human beings to adapt to the environment in which they live. Our brains are wired to work in pretty much any environment on Earth, and maybe elsewhere, who knows. But in order for that to happen, the environment communicates to our developing brains what kinds of abilities and skills and knowledge are needed to develop for that particular environment. And so in the first 3 years, the environment tells the brain through experiences the infant has and observes what kind of environment it is. And the brain will prune away connections that are not used and thus assumed not to be necessary to the environment. On the other hand, things that you do a lot in your native language, speaking it and hearing it is the prime example here. Those synapses are strengthened over and over through experience, so that you become very familiar with the sounds of your own language. And those connections you don't need to hear. You don't need to develop for your environment are lost. One example of that is that upon birth and for a few minutes, infants can perceive sounds of all different languages on Earth. You know, there are many phonemes, different sounds we have in English that are not represented in other languages. There are languages that are very much based on tone and click sounds and that kind of thing. At birth and for a little while, infants can differentiate those sounds. But over first year or so, those connections basically get pruned away because they're not needed. Once again, and we become very good at distinguishing our own sounds. One thing I want to emphasize, when you hear use it or lose it, it makes it sound like pruning is some kind of bad thing, some kind of pathological process. It's actually very necessary and important because it leaves only the synapses that are needed so that they can function well. What you see here is a 3-month-old baby's brain has very few connections. They haven't had much experience. Even the fetus in the womb learns a few things. For example, how to move muscles. And so there are small number of synapses that form in the womb. A 6-year-old has had 5 years of experiences and thus has very dense connections in the brain. By the time you're an adult, the environment has communicated which of those synapses are most important, and so pruning has really pruned away a lot of the connections that you don't need. But how does this happen? How does the brain know to do all of this? And we talked a little bit about genetics in the first class, and some of it, of course, lies in genetic programming for how the human body, including the brain, develop. There are 2 ways we are wired to develop. You used to hear a lot about critical periods. Now we're more likely to talk about sensitive periods. During critical periods, specific parts of the brain require very specific kinds of stimuli in order to develop properly. So in the first few months of life, if an infant does not see light and movement, for instance, if you blindfold an infant or an infant who has congenital cataracts and cannot see those things, the connections in the brain will never develop, and so the infant will be blind even if there's nothing wrong with her eyes. One of the things that we've used that kind of information for example, infants born with cataracts At one time, we did not want to do surgery until they were older because the respiratory system is pretty unstable in the first few months of life. But then when it was discovered those infants would be blind, otherwise they now do cataract operations well before those synapses are fully developed. So those are critical periods. You need specific kinds of input at specific times, or connections that are necessary won't form at all. Sensitive periods are more flexible. Sensitive periods are periods when the brain is most easily influenced by input. So, for example, nurturing and parenting, there is a very sensitive period in the first 3 years of life. And later on, what we'll talk about is that nurturing actually helps part of your brain develop in very specific ways. There's a physiological reason for attachment between parents and infants. But there is a little more flexibility about repair of damage done by this. And sensitive periods are more related to the kinds of things that people in different cultures might experience. So every human being's brain expects light and movement and sound to develop hearing and vision, movement to develop motor movement. But in some cultures, you need to be able to see at great distances. In some cultures, you may hear music. The earlier you learn those things, the better. We know children use music, learn music in other languages much more easily than adults do. And part of that is because the brain is so much more sensitive to input during this time. But you can learn some of those things later. But for instance, with the second language, if you learn it certainly after puberty, you'll probably never have an accent that's exactly right, because the brain is kind of beyond being able to do that at that time. So, just emphasizing again that the development of these two kinds of development are genetically wired, but they are differently influenced by the environment. And this is a key part of understanding the importance of parenting and parenting support services and services for adolescent mothers, because it's during a child's early life that much of their potential is being determined. So, we're going to cover this in much more detail later, but the thing to remember is that during gestation, during pregnancy and infancy, the fetus or infant is growing and organizing those brain cells at an extremely rapid rate. So the brain is much more sensitive to environmental influence during gestation and infancy. Only recently have we learned that the same is true of adolescence. Researchers discovered that the prefrontal cortex, the front outer layer of the brain, continues to develop really well into early adulthood. That part of the brain is responsible for very high order kinds of things, such as planning and working memory and organizational skills and what we call executive functioning. During adolescence, there is right before puberty, there is another period of growth of neurons in this part of the brain and growth of new synapses there. And really, this is why it is very important what adolescents do. Education, a good education during this time is critical for building a foundation for higher order thinking. One of the researchers said if a kid lays on the couch playing video games, those are the skills the brain will develop to do. If a kid's playing sports and reading books and performing in school plays, those are the kinds of skills the brain will develop. Important information to remember. So as we go along in this series, we're going to look more specifically at specific parts of the brain from conception to old age to see how they function more as related to different life stages. We'll also talk about how genes and the environment work together to shape the structure and functioning based on the material we learned in the genetics part. So let's get first a general idea about how the brain works. So there are a lot of ways to look at the brain. A cross-sectional slice is different than an overhead slice, various other ways to look at the brain. If you think again about from the bottom up principle, what you see here is that the brainstem at the very bottom, as you'll note, parts of that part of the brain are responsible for the very simple functioning, heartbeat, sleep, breathing, and you don't ever have to think about those things. They're extremely functional. As you move up to further areas of the brain, they're more complex kinds of things. So for example, motor movement and balance is more complex than some of the autonomic functions handled by the brainstem. But if you've got a brainstem injury that causes lack of oxygen to the brain, as someone with cystic fibrosis might have, or not multiple sclerosis, but other kinds of diseases, that inefficient oxygen flow may result in difficulties with motor movement and balance. Going further up the brain, the limbic system of the brain is where our memory, and particularly emotional memory, is seated mostly, again based on the integrity of the other functions of the brain. So if you look here, you'll see that you can also look at the brain according to the lobes. So we know that in the frontal lobe, for example, much of the complexity resides. We learned about lobes of the brain through observing individuals with specific injuries to their heads and noticing which skills or what knowledge they lost as a result, including the famous Phineas Gage story. And you can Google Phineas Gage and see a little video about what happened to him and how his particular injury clued us into the importance of the limbic system of the brain. Now remember, it's not just from the bottom up, it's from the inside out. The area you see here in purple is the outer level of the brain, the cortex, and the cerebral cortex is where the tough stuff gets done. Planning, executive planning, functioning, thinking. But again, it's important to remember that development and functioning of that outer layer of the brain depends upon the integrity of the other inner structures. Bruce Perry, the founder of the Child Trauma Academy, divides the brain in another way in his work with abused children as he's looked at the effects of child abuse on brains. He divides it into the 4 parts that you see here. noting that plasticity is increased as well as complexity with higher levels of the brain. So an early injury to the brainstem, for example, is much harder to repair than an injury to the neocortex. An early injury of sensory organs or movement, parts of the brain responsible for movement, much less plastic to deal with. Now, in another view, he noted the functions from simple to complex, and if you look at the list on the right here, you can see this illustrated. Certainly within each of these 4 parts of the brain that Perry points out, there are individual parts that handle specific functions, and certainly all of these work together. We'll talk in a moment about how that relates. The little blue lines that you see at the bottom, you see little blue triangles, and then the lines extend up through the entire brain. This represents the development of neuroreceptors, which start very early in the brain. Neuroreceptors are those chemicals that synapses use to exchange information. Serotonin is one, dopamine is one. So they are critical to the body, critical to the brain, and working together. They start their development in gestation and continue throughout life. It's neuroreceptors such as serotonin and dopamine that research has related to mental health in recent years. Finally, I want to show Perry's illustration of how the cortex, the highest part of the brain, as it develops the ability to govern the other parts of the brain. So when you're a little kid and you want something you can't have, and you have a temper tantrum, that's because it's the limbic system of your brain that's pretty much driving your actions at that age. As you get older, your cortex develops more fully and is able to govern the other parts of your brain a little bit better. And this is why we say, teenagers look like adults, but that cortex is not fully mature yet. And so many bad decisions get made and risky behavior takes place. And it's partly because the thinking part of the brain is not having enough influence over the rest of the brain. Teenagers know that driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs is dangerous. They have that knowledge. It's up there. But it does not as easily govern what they actually do in their behavior because of this further development that's needed. So in this unit, we've talked about parts of the brain a little bit and about the functioning. Later on, when we talk about the life stages, we'll look more specifically about how and when those parts develop, and in particular, how the environment influences development of those parts of the brain. Thank you very much.